500 years before Columbus, Viking longships touched the shores of a new world. This is a sleep story woven from that deep historical mystery, a tale that will transform how you see the map of human discovery. By the end, you will understand the true story of the first European feet on American soil, a saga of courage, conflict, and a forgotten colony. We will uncover why these fierce explorers sailed into the unknown, what happened when they met the people already living there, and why their bold American dream ultimately vanished into the Arctic mists. What forgotten courage do you think it takes to sail off the edge of your known world? The world they left behind was a land of deep, silent fjords and towering, snow-capped peaks. In the late 10th century, Scandinavia was not a single kingdom, but a patchwork of powerful chieftains ruling from their great longhouses. Picture a smoky hall, its timber walls hung with shields, the air thick with the smell of roasting meat and wood smoke. Outside, on narrow strips of fertile soil between the mountains and the sea, free farmers tended their barley and their herds. Life here was hard, beautiful, and fiercely independent. But it was also becoming crowded. As families grew and the best farmland was claimed, a powerful restlessness took hold. The horizon, once a boundary, became an invitation. This was not merely a hunger for raid and plunder, though that was part of their story. It was a deeper, more fundamental drive, the search for land. Land to farm, land to build upon, land to call one's own. And beyond land, they sought resources their rocky homeland lacked in abundance, especially the one commodity essential for building their ships and their homes, timber. The great forests of Norway were being harvested, and the need for more sent their gaze westward, across a sea that was both a highway and a mystery. This was the engine of their expansion, a practical need married to an unconquerable spirit. They were masters of the sea, their sleek longships a terrifying and brilliant technology, capable of crossing open ocean or sailing up the shallowest river. So when the stories began to drift back, tales from a lost sailor named Bjarni Herjolfsson who had seen mysterious forested coasts far to the west, they did not hear a warning. They heard a promise, the promise of a new beginning waiting beyond the edge of every map they knew. So how do we know any of this happened? Our window into this vanished world comes not from archaeology alone, but from stories. Centuries after the voyages, in the snug scriptoria of Icelandic monasteries or by the firesides of great farms, scribes and storytellers began to write down the old tales. They produced the Icelandic sagas, and two in particular are our treasure maps, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. Do not think of these as dry, factual history books. They are something far more compelling and, for historians, more challenging. They are family sagas, dramatic narratives centered on bloodlines, honor, feud, and fate. They were written down 200 years or more after the events they describe, passed through generations by word of mouth. This means they are a fascinating blend of probable fact and certain folklore, of genuine geographical detail woven with mythical encounters and family propaganda. Think of them not as a news report, but as a gripping historical novel based on a true story, where the line between what definitely happened and what makes a better tale is beautifully, frustratingly blurred. Their reliability is a puzzle scholars have debated for generations. The sagas agree on the broad, breathtaking strokes that Vikings from Greenland, led by Leif-erikson, found a land rich with grapes and timber they called Vinland. But they disagree on the specifics: who exactly went on which voyage, the order of events, even the name of the first European to step ashore. One saga says it was Leif himself, another credits a man named Thorfinn Karlsefni. This isn't necessarily proof they are wrong. It is proof they are human stories told by different families with different pride at stake, remembering and embellishing their ancestors' roles in a great adventure. The challenge, then, is the delicate work of separating the historical kernel from the literary shell. where the sagas align with each other and, crucially, with the hard evidence slowly unearthed by trowels in the soil, we can listen with more confidence. They give us names, motivations, conflicts, and a vivid sense of the Viking mind. They tell us why they sailed, what they hoped to find, and the shadows that eventually chased them home. They are our only narrative bridge to that moment, making the cold stones of an archaeological site whisper with human voices. The sagas point us to one man as the architect of this entire westward expansion, a figure of formidable will and shrewd persuasion. His name was Erik Thorvaldsson, though history remembers him by the color of his beard and his temper, Erik the Red. His story begins not with exploration but with exile. In Iceland, a land already settled by Vikings fleeing the kings of Norway, Erik was involved in a series of violent feuds. The details are murky, but the outcome was stark. He was found guilty of manslaughter and banished from Iceland for 3 years. For a man of his standing, this was not just a punishment, it was an existential crisis. With his family and loyal followers, he faced a choice: fade into obscurity or gamble everything on the open sea. He chose the gamble. Sailing west into the unknown, he eventually sighted a colossal, forbidding coastline, a land of immense glaciers and stark, rocky fjords. He spent his exile exploring its more hospitable edges, and he found something remarkable. In the deep, sheltered inlets on the southwestern coast, the climate was surprisingly milder than the icy interior suggested. Here, grass could grow for grazing, and small farms could be established. When his sentence ended, he returned to Iceland with a plan. He knew he needed people to build a new community, and to get them, he employed what might be the first recorded instance of strategic marketing. He called this harsh, beautiful, ice-rimmed place Greenland. The name was a brilliant piece of propaganda. As he reportedly said, people would be more attracted to come if it had an appealing name. And it worked. Around 985, he led a fleet of 25 ships filled with hopeful settlers to found the eastern settlement. This was not a random outpost, it was a deliberate colony, the first permanent European foothold in the New World. Greenland became the essential base camp, the launching pad from which all further exploration would spring. It was here, in this fragile Arctic society, that stories of lands even farther west would take root and grow from rumor into irresistible ambition. What kind of person, having carved a life from such a marginal frontier, would then look past its horizons toward another? The son of such a man was destined for more than a quiet life in a Greenlandic fjord. Leif-erikson, often called Leif the Lucky, inherited his father's boldness but tempered it with a different kind of vision. While still a young man, Leif sailed from Greenland back to the ancestral homeland of Norway, a journey that would change him forever. At the court of King Olaf Tryggvason, he encountered the rising tide of Christianity sweeping across the Norse world. He converted, embracing this new faith with the same conviction he applied to all things, and the king gave him a sacred task to return to Greenland and convert the settlers there. So Leif set sail for home, a missionary now as well as a seafarer, his mind filled with psalms rather than sagas, but the North Atlantic had other plans. A tremendous storm seized his ship, driving it far off the known sea routes for days on end. When the winds finally calmed and the mist cleared, his crew saw a coastline unlike any in Greenland or Iceland. They had made a landfall no European could have charted. Cautiously, they went ashore. The first place they explored was barren and desolate, a plain of great flat stones. Leif named it Helluland, meaning slab land. Pushing south, they found a second coast, this one flat and wooded with endless white beaches. He called this Markland or forest land. But it was the third landing that took their breath away. Sailing further still, they entered a sheltered bay where a river flowed from a lake into the sea. Here, the grass remained green even into the winter. The salmon in the river were larger than any they had seen, and the climate was so mild that, according to the saga, they found wild grapes growing. To men from the Arctic, this was a paradise of abundance. Leif named it Vinland, which likely means wineland or meadowland, a place of such promise it must have felt like a reward from his new god for surviving the storm. In that moment, standing on that fertile shore, Leif-erikson was no longer just a missionary blown off course. He had become the discoverer of a continent. Leif and his men had stumbled into a world that defied their northern understanding. The sagas paint Vinland not just as a place but as a revelation. They describe a coastline of deep bays and navigable rivers where the grass stayed green long into the season and the dew on it tasted as sweet as honey. They marveled at the towering trees, perfect for shipbuilding and timber, a treasure beyond price to men from the nearly treeless coasts of Greenland and Iceland. And then there were the gifts they had never expected. The saga tells of fields of self-sown wheat growing wild and ready for harvest, and vines heavy with grapes. For Norse explorers whose diet relied on livestock and what scant barley they could coax from thin soil, this was a vision of effortless abundance. The winters were so mild that livestock could graze outdoors all season, a thought that must have seemed miraculous. This was not a harsh frontier to be endured, but a fertile paradise to be claimed. It felt like a land that provided everything without demand, a place where a new society could not just survive but truly thrive. The name Vinland itself is at the heart of a modern mystery. Does it come from the Old Norse word for wine, vin, pointing to those prolific grapevines? Or does it derive from vin, meaning meadow or pasture, describing those lush, open grasslands? The grape interpretation has fueled centuries of speculation because wild grapes have a very specific northern limit. This botanical clue has sent historians and archaeologists on a long quest to match the saga's description to a real map. Could Vinland be Newfoundland, where the Norse site of l-anse-aux-meadows was found? The landscape there fits many descriptions: the bays, the islands, the berries, but grapes do not grow that far north. This suggests the explorers ventured further south, perhaps to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, Nova Scotia, or even the coasts of New Brunswick or Maine, where wild grapes are plentiful. The sagas likely describe not a single settlement, but an entire region explored over many seasons. So picture not just one point on a map, but a coastline unfolding in the Norse imagination, a promised land of warm rivers, endless forests, and shores that offered a life of plenty they could only have dreamed of in their icy homelands. What would you risk to build a new life in such a place? They did not just admire this new land from the shore. Leif ordered his crew to build booths, those classic Norse temporary shelters of turf and timber along the protected shoreline. They would spend the winter there, a necessary step to truly understand the rhythms of this place. Through the short days and long nights they explored. They fished the teeming waters, they marveled at the vast herds of game in the forests, and they filled their ships' hold with a prized cargo of timber and grapes. The settlement, which the sagas call Stromfjord, was more than a camp. It was a statement of intent, a proof of concept that Europeans could not only reach this land but live in it through its seasons. Yet Leif's luck, the quality that would define his legend, was about to manifest in an extraordinary way. On their journey back to Greenland the following spring, they spotted a group of desperate men clinging to a rocky reef. They were the survivors of a merchant ship that had foundered, stranded and facing certain death. Leif rescued them all, not just saving their lives but by the law of the sea, claiming the valuable cargo from their wrecked vessel. He returned to Greenland with two priceless treasures, the knowledge of Vinland and a ship laden with goods that made him a wealthy man. From that day forward, he was known as Leif the Lucky, a name that spoke to both his good fortune and the boldness required to seize it. His successful overwintering proved Vinland was not a mirage but a real habitable territory, and like any valuable discovery, it could not remain a secret for long. The stories he brought back of endless timber and self-sown wheat ignited a fever in Greenland. Soon others would look west, dreaming of their own fortune. But they would find that the land of plenty was not empty and that luck could wear thin under an unfamiliar sky. Leif's brother could not resist the call of the new world. Thorvald Eriksson, inheriting the family's restless spirit, believed Vinland could be more than a source of timber. It could be a permanent home. He took Leif's old ship and a crew of 30 men, sailing west with a clear purpose, to explore the country more thoroughly than his brother had, and to find the perfect site for a lasting settlement. They arrived at Leif's old booths and used them as their base, then spent the first winter exploring the surrounding coastlines in their smaller boat. The sagas say they found the land beautiful beyond measure, with white sandy beaches and forests that seemed to stretch on forever. For a time, it must have felt like a dream fulfilled. Then, in the second summer, the dream shattered. Sailing around a wooded headland, they spotted something on the beach. 3 strange boats, made not of wood but of animal hide, turned upside down on the shore. And beneath each boat they saw 3 men. These were the people the Norse would come to call the Skrælings, a word that likely meant wretches or weaklings in Old Norse, reflecting their own fear and misunderstanding. In truth, they had encountered the indigenous people of that coast, likely the ancestors of the Beothuk or the Micmac. The meeting began in terrifying violence. The Norse, perhaps thinking themselves under threat or simply acting on instinct, captured and killed 8 of the 9 men they found. Only one escaped in his skin boat, paddling away to spread the news of these fierce, bearded strangers. That single act of aggression set a dark precedent. It turned a moment of first contact into the first bloodshed, planting a seed of fear and hostility that would define all future encounters. The Norse, feeling triumphant and secure, did not yet understand the consequence. They slept on their ship that night, confident in their strength. But with the dawn came a sound they had never heard before, a great echoing hum from the woods like a swarm of angry bees. It was the war cry of a people defending their home. Suddenly, the water around the headland was filled with a multitude of skin boats carrying warriors armed with bows. The Norse, in their heavy mail shirts, formed a shield wall on deck, a defensive tactic that had served them well in European battles. But this was a different kind of war. The indigenous warriors did not come close. Instead, they rained arrows down upon the ship from a distance, a relentless, whistling storm of projectiles. The Norse shields could not cover everyone. One arrow found its mark, striking Thorvald Eriksson in the armpit, a gap in his armor. He knew at once the wound was mortal. As his men fought off the attack and the boats retreated, Thorvald lay dying. He asked his crew to carry him to a headland he had admired, a place with a beautiful view of the sea and the forests. There, with his last breaths, he spoke words that have echoed down the centuries, a poignant mix of regret and awe. He said, "This is a fine country. Here I should like to make my home." Then he died and was buried on that headland, his grave marked with crosses at his head and feet. In that single, heartbreaking moment, the promise of Vinland became infinitely more complex. It was a land of beauty and abundance, yes, but also a land already deeply loved and fiercely defended by others. Thorvald's final wish acknowledged its allure, even as his death revealed its peril. The dream of a peaceful colony now had to contend with a harsh new reality. The death of Thorvald Eriksson was a warning, but not a deterrent. The dream of Vinland was too powerful, its promise too rich to be abandoned. Into this fraught space stepped a man with the means and the vision to try again, but on a grander scale. His name was Thorfinn Karlsefni, a wealthy and respected merchant chieftain from Iceland. He was not a hot-headed explorer, but a pragmatic businessman. He saw in Vinland not just adventure, but an investment opportunity of unprecedented scale, a chance to establish a self-sustaining colony that could control the flow of valuable timber, furs, and perhaps even that mysterious wine back to Greenland and Iceland. To succeed where others had faltered, he knew he needed more than just warriors. He needed a community. His plan was audacious in its completeness. He gathered a fleet of 3 ships and filled them not only with 65 men, but with women, children, and a cargo of hope, cattle, sheep, and all the tools and supplies needed to build a permanent life. This was no seasonal hunting camp. This was an attempt to transplant a full Norse society onto a new continent. Central to this venture was his wife, Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, one of the most vividly drawn women in all the sagas. Her story is extraordinary. She was widowed in Greenland, survived a plague, traveled to Norway, and now stood ready to cross the Western Ocean. Gudrid was more than a passenger. She was a partner in this gamble, a woman whose intelligence and resilience would become legendary. With this diverse company, Thorfinn sailed for the Promised Land. They arrived at Leif's old booths and settled in, but Thorfinn was thinking bigger. He sent out scouts to find the ideal location, a place with rich pastures, plentiful resources, and strong natural defenses. They found a spot on a fjord where the grass was lush and the salmon leaped in the rivers. Here they built their permanent settlement, a cluster of sturdy longhouses with turf walls and timber frames, with pens for their livestock and boats drawn up on the shore. For a time, the colony thrived. The cattle grazed, children were born, including a son named Snorri, the first European child known to be born in the Americas, and the community felt the rhythm of a normal life. They explored and gathered resources, filling their storehouses with grapes, timber, and pelts. They even established a routine of sorts with the local people, engaging in cautious, silent trade, laying out strips of red cloth and receiving bundles of furs in return. It was a fragile, wordless peace, a moment when it seemed the two worlds might find a way to coexist. But in a land both promised and contested, peace was always the most fragile commodity of all. The settlement buzzed with the sounds of a hopeful new beginning. Picture the longhouses, their thick walls built from slabs of turf stacked like bricks, with sturdy timber frames holding up roofs of sod. Smoke curled from the central hearths, carrying the scent of baking barley bread and simmering stews made from seal meat and dried fish. Outside, the lowing of cattle and the bleating of sheep mingled with the cry of gulls. These animals were their most precious cargo, the living seed of their old world, and their presence on this foreign shore was a profound statement of permanence. Each day was shaped by the rhythm of survival and the dream of prosperity. The men would row out into the fjord in smaller boats, their nets and lines ready for the cod and hallie, but that teemed in the cold waters. Others ventured into the endless forests, their axes ringing against the trunks of mighty oaks and pines, cutting the timber that was worth more than silver back in Greenland. The women and children gathered berries from the sun-dappled clearings, collected bird eggs from coastal cliffs, and tended to the precious dairy cows, churning butter and making cheese to last through the winter. There was hope, too, for a future harvest. In cleared plots near the settlement, they likely attempted to sow barley seed brought from home, testing whether this generous land could support the grain that was the backbone of their diet and their culture. For a time, it must have felt like the saga's promise was being fulfilled. Children like Thorfinn and Gudrid's son Snorri took their first steps on the soft grass by the shore, their laughter a new sound in that ancient place. In the longhouse at night, by the fire's glow, stories of Iceland and Greenland were told alongside plans for the next season's exploration. Yet this fragile normality was always shadowed by a deep, unspoken tension. Sentries were posted, their eyes scanning the tree line where the forest met the meadow. Every unusual sound, the crack of a branch, the call of an unfamiliar bird, could make hands tighten around tools, transforming them into weapons. The memory of Thorvald's death was a ghost in their community, a constant reminder that this land of plenty was not theirs alone. They lived in a state of watchful prosperity, their daily triumphs of a full fishing net or a healthy calf always tempered by the wary glance toward the woods, wondering when the Skraelings would appear again and what their next meeting would bring. The first sighting would have been a moment of profound stillness. From the edge of the forest, figures emerged, watching the strange, bearded people and their great wooden ship. For the indigenous tribes, likely ancestors of the Beothuk or Micmac, these newcomers were a mystery that had stepped out of the ocean itself. The Norse, for their part, felt a deep, instinctive wariness. They remembered Thorvald's fate, the hum of arrows from the woods, yet necessity and a flicker of mutual curiosity overcame fear. Neither side spoke the other's language, so communication happened through gesture and object. The sagas tell us the Norse held out what they thought were tokens of peace and goodwill, lengths of vivid red cloth, a color rare and captivating in the natural world, and bowls of fresh milk. To us, this seems like an odd pairing, but to the Norse, both were symbols of their civilization: the cloth from their looms and trade networks, the milk from their cherished livestock, the very foundation of their diet. They were offering pieces of their own world. The response from the indigenous people was immediate and practical. They were fascinated by the red cloth, running it through their fingers, perhaps holding it up to the light. They eagerly offered what they had in abundance: bundles of rich, luxurious furs, beaver, otter, marten, and maybe even the highly prized grey fox. For the Norse, shivering through Atlantic winters, these pelts were a fortune, worth more than silver back in Greenland. A silent, efficient barter system took shape. The locals would lay out their furs on a flat rock. The Norse would place their cloth and milk beside them. Each group would then retreat, allowing the other to come forward and take what was offered. It was trade without a shared word, commerce built entirely on mutual need and a fragile, unspoken truce. This quiet exchange laid bare the vast gulf between the two cultures. The Norse stood there in their woven woolen tunics, their belts hung with iron knives and axes, their very presence dependent on a technology of immense complexity, the ocean-going longship, a masterpiece of carpentry and navigation. Their strength was in their tools, their metal, their ability to cross vast distances. The indigenous people, however, possessed a different, deeper power, an intimate, generational knowledge of the land. They moved in skin boats, perfectly adapted to the coastal shallows and rivers, crafted from materials the land provided. They knew where the caribou migrated, where the berries grew sweetest, how to survive the turn of every season. They were not visitors, they were part of the landscape itself. For a few tense, hopeful seasons, this gap was bridged by mutual benefit. The Norse got the furs they craved, and the locals acquired novel, beautiful goods. But such a delicate piece, built on novelty and utility alone, is easily shattered. What happens when the novelty wears off, or when a simple misunderstanding sparks in the space where no common words exist to put it out? The fragile piece held only as long as the unfamiliar remained useful. For a while, the red cloth and the strange white drink were wonders enough. But the Norse settlement was not a trading post. It was a living, breathing piece of a foreign world, and its otherness began to breed fear. The turning point came not from a clash of weapons, but from a sound that shook the very ground. The Norse had brought their cattle, and one day, a great bull that had been grazing in the woods near the settlement caught the scent of the herd and let out a thunderous, echoing bellow. To Norse ears, it was a familiar, almost comforting sound of home. To the indigenous people hidden in the tree line, it was something entirely different. They had never heard such a deep, resonant roar from an animal they could not see. In their experience, a sound of that power and menace could only come from a monstrous spirit or a beast of terrible strength. The sagas say the sound filled them with sheer terror. They dropped their bundles of furs and fled into the forest, their hearts pounding with a new and profound dread. The strangers were not just men with odd goods, they commanded unseen, roaring creatures. This fear curdled into suspicion, and suspicion, in that tense silence, quickly hardened into hostility. When the Skraelings returned, it was not for trade. They came in greater numbers, their faces now painted for war, moving with a coordinated purpose that spoke of a collective decision. The silent barter was over. This time they advanced not with furs but with slings and bows. The battle that followed was a brutal mismatch of technologies. The Norse warriors, clad in iron ringmail and helmets, raised their tall, painted shields to form a solid wall. They were armed with heavy axes, sharp spears, and swords of forged steel, weapons designed to cleave and crush in close combat. Their opponents fought with the tools of their land and their ingenuity: arrows tipped with sharp bone or stone, spears with fire-hardened points, and clubs carved from dense wood. A Norse axe could shatter a wooden shield in a single blow. A steel sword could slice through a leather tunic as if it were parchment. In a direct head-on clash, the Norse weapons were devastatingly superior. Yet the indigenous warriors were not trying to break the shield wall. They fought with clever, adaptive tactics. They would swarm from the woods, loose a volley of arrows, and then melt back into the trees before the Norse could charge. They used the landscape itself as a weapon, attacking from cover and from unexpected directions. During one fierce skirmish, the sagas recount a moment of pure terror that nearly broke the Norse line. The warriors saw a large, pale object rise from behind a ridge like a giant's bladder and sail through the air toward them. It landed among them with a heavy thud, and a moment later it exploded with a deafening bang and a blinding flash. It was, scholars believe, a ball of hide stuffed with a mixture of gravel and what the Norse called vinvidr, possibly a type of sulfurous mineral or even a primitive gunpowder-like substance from a local deposit, ignited and thrown. The effect was psychological warfare of the highest order. To the Norse, it was pure magic, a sorcerous attack they had no defense against. It sowed panic and confusion, a clear sign that their enemies commanded forces beyond their understanding. The Norse won their battles, but they were losing the war for Vinland. Every victory was costly, draining their strength and their nerve. They could hold their settlement against an attack, but they could not safely venture out to cut timber, hunt, or fish without the constant threat of ambush. The very richness of the land, those deep, dark forests that provided such perfect cover, was now turned against them. They began to realize a cold, hard truth. They were not settlers claiming an empty paradise. They were invaders in a populated, defended territory. The land was rich, yes, but it was not free. Its bounty belonged to people who knew every trail, every river bend, and who were willing to fight for it season after season, year after year. The dream of a peaceful, expanding colony began to crumble under the weight of this endless, grinding conflict. How many lives were they willing to spend for timber and grapes? How many winters could they spend barricaded inside their longhouses, listening for a war cry in the wind? Amidst the watchful silence and the shadow of conflict, a new sound rose within the longhouse walls, the cry of a newborn child. In that precarious settlement at the edge of the known world, Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir gave birth to a son. They named him Snorri Thorfinnsson. In the grand sweep of history, this might seem a simple, private event, but in the story of Vinland, it was a moment of monumental significance. Snorri was the first child of European descent known to be born in the Americas. His first breath, drawn in that turf-walled house by the fjord, represented something far greater than a family's joy. He was a living symbol of the future, a fragile root trying to take hold in new soil. While his father and the other men stood guard against threats from the forest, Snorri's existence was a quiet, powerful argument for permanence. He was not a visitor or an explorer, he was a native. This land was the only world he would know. His birth promised a continuity that raids and skirmishes could not easily erase. It suggested a lineage, a generation that would grow up speaking Old Norse but knowing the taste of wild grapes and the sound of this new sea. For Gudrid and Thorfinn, he was not just a son, but the embodiment of their gamble, the human heart of their American dream. In his small, sleeping form lay the potential for a true transatlantic community, a bridge between the old world and the new, yet that potential was cradled in a place of increasing danger. Every lullaby sung by Gudrid was underscored by the tension outside. The very hope Snorri represented also made the settlers more vulnerable, more invested, and more afraid to lose what they had begun to build. How do you protect a future when the present feels so perilously thin? The birth of Snorri made the stakes of their venture painfully personal. Every skirmish, every shadow in the woods was no longer just a threat to a trading post, but a danger to their child's future. As the seasons turned, the mood within the longhouses shifted from hopeful expansion to grim assessment. Thorfinn Karlsefni, the pragmatic leader, called a council of all the settlers. They gathered in the largest hall, the firelight flickering on faces etched with fatigue and worry. The time had come for a brutal accounting to weigh the dream against the daily reality. On one side of the scale lay riches almost beyond measure. Vinland's bounty was real. Their storehouses held stacks of precious timber, each oak beam worth a fortune back home. Bundles of luxurious furs, softer and thicker than any from the Arctic, were ready for trade. The land itself promised endless potential, pastures where their cattle grew fat, rivers teeming with fish, and forests full of game. For families who had known the thin soils of Iceland and the harsh limits of Greenland, this was a land of miraculous abundance. It was everything the sagas had promised. To leave felt like turning their backs on a gift from the gods themselves, but the other side of the scale held a heavier weight. The constant, grinding threat of attack had worn them down. They could not tend their livestock, forage for berries, or even cut timber without an armed guard. The isolation was profound. They were over 1,000 miles from the nearest Norse settlement in Greenland, itself a fragile outpost on the edge of the world. A message for help was impossible. A supply ship might not come for years, if ever. They were utterly on their own, and while their weapons were superior in a fight, they were vastly outnumbered by people who knew the land intimately and had no reason to stop defending it. This was not a war they could win, only a siege they could endure. And at what cost? The dream of a peaceful, growing colony was dead, replaced by the grim prospect of a fortified outpost living in perpetual fear. The decision, when it came, was heavy-hearted but unanimous. The promise was not worth the peril. The risk to their families, to their very lineage, was too great. So they began the sorrowful work of departure. They loaded their ships with the most valuable cargo, the timber, the furs, the tools. What they could not take, they likely destroyed to prevent it from being used by others. And then, in a final, symbolic act, they put their longhouses to the torch. They watched as the flames consumed the turf walls and timber frames, the homes where their children had taken first steps and where they had dared to imagine a new life. The smoke, rising into the sky over Vinland, was the funeral pyre of the first European attempt to colonize the Americas. They turned their ships east toward Greenland, leaving behind only smoldering ruins, a few buried artifacts, and a ghost of what might have been. What does it mean when the greatest discovery of your age is also a place you must flee? The story of Vinland, however, did not end with Thorfinn's retreat. A final, chilling voyage would be led by a woman of terrifying resolve, revealing the darkest potential of the Viking spirit in this new world. Her name was Freydis Eiriksdottir, daughter of Eric the Red and sister to Leif the Lucky. She was a figure carved from the same formidable stock as her father, but where his ambition built settlements, hers would sow only betrayal and blood. Years after the main colony was abandoned, Freydis organized a smaller, private expedition with two Icelandic brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, agreeing to share profits from the venture. They sailed their separate ships to Leif's old camp in Vinland, an agreement already strained by rivalry. The brothers built their own house at a distance, while Freydis and her husband, Thorvard, settled into Leif's original booth. The winter was harsh and tensions simmered in the cold. Then, one morning, Freydis acted. She left her house barefoot, walking through the frost to the brothers' dwelling. She asked to speak with Finnbogi privately, her face a mask of distress. She told him a terrible lie, claiming her husband, Thorvard, had beaten her and that she wished to leave him. She proposed a secret deal, asking Finnbogi to trade his larger ship for her smaller one so she could escape. Finnbogi, an honorable man, agreed to help. But this was all a ruse. Freydis returned to her own house and climbed back into bed, her feet icy and marked with dew. When her husband awoke, she performed her treachery. She pretended to weep, telling Thorvald a very different story. She claimed the brothers had lured her to their house, beaten her, and threatened her life. She shamed Thorvald, asking if he, a man from Greenland, would let Icelanders dishonor his wife so terribly and get away with it. She told him she would leave him if he did not avenge her. Enraged and goaded, Thorvald roused their men. They seized their weapons and marched on the brothers' house at dawn, catching the Icelanders asleep. They bound Helgi and Finnbogi and their crew, dragging each man outside. As they stood there, Freydis gave the final, monstrous order. "Kill them all," she said, "leave no one alive to tell the tale." Her men hesitated, refusing to murder defenseless captives. So Freydis snatched an axe from one of them. She walked up to the 5 women who had accompanied the brothers' expedition. Finding no man willing to do it, she herself murdered all 5. With that act, the massacre was complete. Freydis and her crew took the brothers' ship and all their goods, sailing back to Greenland with their plunder. She threatened every member of her crew with death if they spoke of the events, and for a time the secret held, but such darkness cannot stay buried. Leif-erikson eventually heard rumors and tortured 3 of the men until they confessed the full truth. He was horrified but could not bring himself to punish his own sister. He instead cursed her, prophesying that her descendants would never prosper. This brutal tale serves as a stark reminder: the sagas are not simple hero stories. They are complex human documents that show the full spectrum of courage and cruelty, of visionary discovery and petty, murderous greed. Freydis' story shows that the failure in Vinland was not just about conflict with the indigenous people. It was also about the internal flaws the settlers brought with them, the old world feuds and ruthless ambitions that could poison the promise of a new one. Their ships turned east, leaving Vinland's promise to the forest and the fog. For the Norse of Greenland, life went on, but the dream of a Western empire had vanished like a ship over the horizon. The Greenland settlements, eastern and western, were not just outposts, they were home to generations. For nearly 500 years, these communities endured on the very edge of the habitable world, a testament to human tenacity. Their longhouses stood in the fjords, their churches pointed steeples toward the sky, their cows grazed on the sparse grass. They traded walrus ivory and narwhal tusks, sold as unicorn horns in Europe, for the iron, timber, and luxuries they could not produce. They were connected, however tenuously, to the wider Norse world. And then, in the 15th century, they simply ceased to exist. The last written record is a marriage record from the church at Valsey in 1408. After that, silence. When European ships finally returned to those fjords in the 16th century, they found only empty stone ruins being slowly reclaimed by the turf, and a different people living there, the Inuit. The Norse of Greenland had vanished, leaving behind one of history's most haunting cold cases. What happened to them? The answer is not a single cataclysm, but a slow tightening of a noose woven from many strands. The first and most relentless strand was the climate. Beginning in the 13th century, the world entered a period now called the Little Ice Age. Temperatures across the North Atlantic began a slow, inexorable decline. Summers grew shorter and cooler, winters stretched longer and more brutal. The sea ice, which usually retreated in summer, began to linger longer and push farther south, blocking the vital sea lanes to Iceland and Europe for more of the year. For a society whose survival depended on a short growing season to produce hay for livestock, this was a disaster. Grass grew poorly and the hay harvests failed. Their cherished cattle, the symbol of their European identity, grew thin and died. They were forced to rely more on seal hunting, but even the seals' migration patterns may have shifted with the changing currents. The very environment that had once been marginal but manageable became actively hostile. The second strand was isolation. As Europe was ravaged by the Black Death and its economies transformed, the demand for Greenland's exotic goods like walrus ivory dwindled. Fewer and fewer trade ships made the dangerous journey to that remote coast. With fewer ships came fewer essential imports: iron for tools and weapons, timber for repairing ships and homes, and perhaps most critically, the cultural and religious reinforcement from the homeland. The Greenlanders were being forgotten. The last bishop died and was never replaced. The last supply ship likely sailed without knowing it was the last. They were on their own at the very time they needed outside support the most. The third strand involves their neighbors. As the climate cooled, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, known to archaeology as the Thule culture, expanded southward along the coast. Masters of the Arctic environment, they possessed technologies perfectly adapted to the changing world: sleek kayaks and umiaks for hunting in icy waters, sophisticated toggle harpoons, warm clothing made from sealskin, and dog sleds for transportation over land and ice. The Norse, in contrast, clung to their European way of life: their woolen clothing, their pastoral farming, their heavy, ocean-going ships that were becoming trapped by the increasing ice. While there is little archaeological evidence of widespread violent conflict, the relationship was likely one of tense competition for the same dwindling resources: seals, walrus, and good landing spots. The Norse, outnumbered and out-adapted, may have found themselves squeezed into an ever smaller ecological niche. So did they die out, or did they leave? The evidence points to a grim end in place. There are no mass graves suggesting plague or war. Instead, the skeletal remains found show signs of increasing malnutrition, stunted growth, and genetic isolation. Their diet, as shown by bone chemistry, shifted almost entirely to marine sources, a sign their farms had utterly failed. The final generation likely faced a desperate choice: starve in their stone houses by the fjord, or attempt a perilous escape in ships they could no longer properly repair across an ice-choked sea. Some may have tried to sail for Iceland or even back to the mythical Vinland, but no record exists of their arrival. More haunting is the possibility that the last survivors, weakened and dwindling, may have been absorbed into Inuit communities through trade or marriage, their distinct identity dissolving over a generation. The Greenland colony did not fall with a bang, but with a whisper, a slow fading of light from a longhouse window, a final prayer in an empty church, the last cow lowing in a snow-covered field. Their 500-year saga ended not with conquest but with silence, as the Arctic cold and their own isolation closed in like the pack ice around a stranded ship. So the voyages to Vinland passed from living memory into the realm of story. For the next 5 centuries, the entire astonishing episode was known only through the fragile pages of a few Icelandic manuscripts, copied and recopied by hand in remote monastic houses. In the grand halls of European learning, however, these tales were not considered history. To the scholars and mapmakers of the Renaissance, fixated on the triumphant narrative of Christopher Columbus, the idea that illiterate Norse seafarers had reached America half a millennium earlier seemed preposterous, a charming but impossible fairy tale. The sagas were treated as literature, not documentary evidence, beautiful, heroic fictions about a mythical place called Wineland, as fanciful as the tales of Atlantis or El Dorado. This dismissal was cemented by geography itself. The Norse settlements in Greenland had vanished, leaving no living bridge back to Europe. Without physical proof, Vinland became a ghost in the historical record, a shimmering mirage on the edge of the known world. It was relegated to a curious footnote, an asterisk in the story of discovery that everyone agreed truly began in 1492. The Viking voyages were not forgotten, but they were comfortably neutered, transformed from a factual account of exploration into a national legend for Icelanders and Scandinavians, a story of ancestral bravery with no more weight on the world stage than the adventures of King Arthur. The maps of the New World were drawn without it, the history books written around it. Vinland slept, a dream preserved in vellum, waiting for someone to find a key that would turn legend back into fact. What kind of evidence could possibly awaken a story that had slept for 1,000 years? That key was not a document, but a place. In the summer of 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad arrived on the remote northern tip of Newfoundland with a radical idea and a worn copy of the sagas. He was not a traditional archaeologist, but a man with a detective's mind and a deep understanding of northern landscapes. For years, he had studied the texts, cross-referencing the saga descriptions with maps and nautical charts. He became convinced that Vinland was not a mythic paradise far to the south, but a real, tangible location on the North Atlantic coast, and he suspected it might be in Canada. His search was methodical. He traveled thousands of miles by small boat, interviewing fishermen and combing the rugged coastline for any sign, any anomaly that might match the saga's clues. A place with a shallow bay, a river flowing from a lake, islands for shelter, and most importantly, meadows where grass could grow. He was looking for the specific geography that could have supported a Norse camp. His partner in this quest was his wife, Anne Stein Ingstad, a trained archaeologist whose meticulous eye would prove essential. Together, they followed the coast, their hopes often dashed by dead ends. Then, a local fisherman named George Decker in the tiny, windswept village of l-anse-aux-meadows mentioned something interesting. He showed them some overgrown ridges near the shore, strange grassy mounds that the locals called the Old Indian Camp. But to Helge and Anne Stein, these did not look like any indigenous site they knew. The shape was wrong. With a rising sense of anticipation, they began a preliminary excavation. Their trowels soon scraped against not stone, but charcoal-blackened earth and fire-cracked rocks, the unmistakable signature of ancient hearths. Then they found the outline. The grassy mounds concealed the foundations of buildings, but not just any buildings. The walls were made of turf, carefully cut and stacked in the distinct Norse style. The layout was a classic Norse hall, with a central fireplace and low earthen benches along the sides. Over the next 7 years, Anne Stein led a full-scale international archaeological excavation. Slowly, carefully, the site gave up its secrets. They uncovered the remains of 8 distinct structures, 3 large halls, several smaller huts, a forge, and even a charcoal kiln. This was not a temporary camp. This was a small, organized settlement capable of supporting between 70 and 90 people. The evidence was overwhelming and precise. In the forge, they found a stone anvil and lumps of iron slag, proof the Norse had processed bog iron, a skill indigenous people of the region did not possess at that time. They found a bronze-ringed pin, a distinctively Norse clothing fastener. Most tellingly, they found a simple stone spindle whorl used for spinning wool. This small object spoke volumes. It meant women were present, spinning yarn from the sheep they had brought with them. Every artifact, every post hole, every layer of soil screamed one thing: Vikings had been here. The discovery at l-anse-aux-meadows was an earthquake in the world of history. It proved beyond any reasonable doubt that the Norse sagas were not fiction. They were based on real voyages, real landfalls, and a real settlement in the New World centuries before Columbus. A legend had been pulled from the pages and planted firmly in the earth, waiting for the right seekers to find it. But if this was Vinland, why did it look more like a base camp than the land of grapes and endless timber the sagas described? The foundations at l-anse-aux-meadows are quiet ghosts of that distant ambition. Walk with me now across that grassy headland where the wind from Epaves Bay carries the salt tang of the Atlantic. Underfoot, the earth is not flat. It rises in gentle, rectangular swells, like the buried bones of giants resting just beneath the turf. These are the outlines of those 8 buildings, carefully excavated and now preserved for all to see. The largest is unmistakable, a classic Norse longhouse. Its outline stretches nearly 90 feet, a narrow rectangle with a central aisle, and the low earthen benches where people once slept, ate, and told stories. You can stand at its entrance and look down its length, and you are standing in the exact footprint of a house built 1,000 years ago. Nearby are smaller huts, perhaps for storage or workshops. But two structures tell a particularly vivid story. One is a small, sturdy building with a large, stone-lined pit in its center. This was the smithy. Here, the Norse practiced one of their most essential and secretive crafts, ironworking. They would have collected bog iron, a rusty deposit found in peat marshes, and in this very pit built a furnace of stone and clay. With bellows made from animal skins, they would have pumped air into the fire, reaching temperatures hot enough to melt the iron out of the ore. The proof is still there in the form of dark, bubbly slag, the waste product of that process found scattered around the site. This slag is not just an artifact, it is a technological signature. The indigenous peoples of this region in the year 1000 did not smelt iron. This material could only have been produced by Europeans. Nearby lies another workshop, likely for carpentry, where the precious timber of Markland was shaped and planed. The artifacts pulled from this soil are humble, but each is a voice. A single bronze-ringed pin used to fasten a cloak, a simple stone oil lamp, its shallow dish blackened by soot. Dozens of iron nails, both wrought and riveted, of the exact type used in Viking shipbuilding and construction. Each nail is a tiny testament to their seafaring technology, and each was made here on this spot from the iron they processed themselves. These objects are not grand treasures of gold or silver. They are the everyday tools of survival and industry, dropped or discarded by people going about the hard work of building a life in a new world. They are the intimate, physical proof that the saga characters were real people who lit fires, mended clothes, repaired their ships, and looked out from this very shore, wondering what the next tide would bring. L-anse-aux-meadows is a powerful confirmation, not of a lost colony, but of a strategic foothold. This was not the sprawling, grape-laden Vinland of the sagas. Think of it instead as a gateway, a base camp of operations. The settlement's layout and the evidence within point to a very specific purpose: repair, resupply, and staging for journeys into the interior of a new continent. The presence of the smithy, the carpentry workshop, and the large halls capable of housing nearly 100 people all suggest a planned, organized effort. They built this place not to put down permanent roots in this specific spot, but to use it as a secure harbor from which to launch further exploration. The Norse called this entire region Vinland, and l-anse-aux-meadows was their operational headquarters within it. They likely used it for a relatively short time, perhaps only a decade or so, as a winter haven and a repair dock before pushing deeper into the promise of the land. What the site confirms with stunning clarity is the saga's core geographic truth. The descriptions of sailing past a barren Helluland, a forested Markland, and then reaching a place with a shallow bay, a river flowing from a lake, and islands for shelter match this stretch of Newfoundland's coast with uncanny precision. The sagas got the where astonishingly right, but the archaeology also reveals what the stories left out or condensed. The lack of evidence for farming, animal pens, or a cemetery tells us this was not intended as a self-sufficient agricultural community. The settlers here were not planting fields, they were processing iron to make nails for ship repairs, and they were shaping timber into planks and beams. This was a workshop and a barracks, a place to prepare for the next voyage. This distinction is crucial because it implies their reach was far broader than this single headland. The sagas speak of grapes and mild winters, things not found on the chilly, subarctic coast of northern Newfoundland. So if l-anse-aux-meadows was the base, where were the resources that inspired the name Vinland? The answer lies in the artifacts themselves. Among the few precious items found were butternuts, the nuts of the butternut tree, which does not grow north of New Brunswick. There was also a single piece of worked wood from a tree native to the Gulf of St. Lawrence region. These are silent, powerful witnesses. They tell us that the people living at l-anse-aux-meadows journeyed south, hundreds of miles by boat, into the warmer, richer lands around what is now Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, or even the northeastern United States. They went there to gather those legendary grapes, to cut the finest timber, and to explore the true bounty of the New World. Their base camp was a gateway to a continent, a launching point for journeys that touched the fabled places the stories celebrated. They stood on that northern shore, but their gaze and their boats were forever turned toward the south, toward the real land of plenty. The butternuts found at l-anse-aux-meadows were a quiet signal pointing a finger southward. If the Norse were gathering resources from warmer forests hundreds of miles away, how far did their curiosity actually take them? The sagas themselves whisper of a place even more distant, a sheltered bay they called Hop, where wild grapes grew in such abundance they could be gathered from the very ground. This description feels distinctly different from the northern base camp. It evokes the rich, deciduous forests and tidal estuaries of regions like Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, or the northeastern United States. The logical conclusion is almost irresistible. The Norse, masters of coastal navigation, likely used their Newfoundland settlement as a springboard, sending exploratory parties sailing down the coastline for weeks or even months at a time. They would have been charting bays, sailing up wide rivers, and making landfall in places that felt increasingly like the paradise the stories promised. These journeys would have been for resource gathering, not settlement, loading their ships with precious timber, grapevines, and perhaps trading with the people they encountered. This was not a continuous voyage of discovery, but a series of probing expeditions, reaching out like tentative fingers from their northern base to touch the edges of a vast, unknown continent. The possibility opens a door to a haunting question. Did they leave any other trace of their passing beyond the foundations at l-anse-aux-meadows? One of the most tantalizing and hotly debated pieces of evidence is a small, worn coin. In 1957, at a Native American shell-midden site in Maine known as the Goddard Site, amateur archaeologists unearthed a single silver coin. It was identified as a Norse penny, minted between 1065 and 1080 during the reign of King Olaf Kyrre of Norway. The discovery, now famous as the Maine penny, sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. Here was a potential artifact that could prove Norse travel far to the south of Newfoundland, dropped or traded over 1,000 miles from their known settlements. The coin's authenticity, however, is mired in controversy. The site where it was found was a major native trade hub, with objects from as far away as Lake Superior present. Critics argue the coin could have arrived through intricate, long-distance indigenous trade networks that span the continent, passed from hand to hand over centuries until it finally came to rest in Maine. They point out that no other Norse artifacts were found at the site, making it a lonely outlier. Proponents counter that its very isolation is what makes it intriguing. It is precisely the kind of object that could be lost or traded during a brief, fleeting encounter. The debate may never be fully settled. The Maine penny stands as a symbol of the tantalizing possibility of deeper exploration, a ghost of a chance meeting on a distant shore. Whether it is direct proof or a red herring, it forces us to consider a broader, more ephemeral story. What if the Norse voyages were not just about one base camp, but about a series of brief, unrecorded landfalls all along the eastern seaboard? Imagine a Norse crew beaching their longship in a sheltered cove to gather fresh water or repair a sail. They might have met a small group of indigenous fishermen, engaged in a few moments of tense, silent barter, a metal knife for a bundle of furs, before pushing back out to sea, leaving behind only a strange story and perhaps a single glittering coin. These encounters would have been too brief, too isolated to leave the kind of archaeological footprint a settlement creates. They would be whispers in the wind, echoes lost to time. The sagas, focused on the drama of settlement and conflict, might have condensed these scattered journeys into the single, symbolic location of Hop. The truth likely lies in a middle ground. The Norse probably did explore the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the coasts of the Maritimes extensively, perhaps even reaching the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. They gathered the grapes and the butternuts that fueled their legends. They may have made contact, trade, and conflict with many different groups, but their presence was a scratch on the surface, not a deep cut. They were visitors in a vast, peopled landscape, and when they left, the forest and the sea quickly erased most signs of their passage. The main penny, real or not, represents that haunting ephemerality, the idea that history is not always written in stone and timber, but sometimes in a single, lost object that hints at a world of stories we will never fully know. The word Skraeling echoes down the centuries, a label born of fear and foreignness. But behind that Norse term were real people with complex cultures and deep histories already rooted in that land. So who were they? The encounters described in the sagas likely brought the Norse into contact with two distinct groups, depending on where and when they landed. On the island of Newfoundland, the people they met were almost certainly the ancestors of the Beothuk. These were a people who lived in small, mobile bands along the coast and in the interior, masters of the rich marine resources. They built conical houses framed with poles and covered with birch bark or caribou skin, and they traveled in graceful, lightweight canoes made from birch bark, perfectly suited to the island's rivers and sheltered bays. Their world revolved around the seasonal hunt for caribou, for seal, for the great flocks of seabirds that nested on the cliffs. They were not a warlike people in the Norse sense. They were survivors, deeply attuned to the rhythms of their environment. When they saw those strange, bearded men with their giant wooden ship, their reaction was likely a mixture of intense curiosity and profound caution. The silent trade of furs for cloth suggests a desire to engage, to understand these newcomers through the universal language of exchange. But the violent turn, sparked by the Norse bull's bellow or a simple misunderstanding, would have confirmed their deepest suspicions. These strangers were dangerous, unpredictable, and they did not understand the shared rules of the land. Further north, in the reaches of Labrador and perhaps the eastern edges of the Arctic that the Norse called Helluland, a different encounter may have taken place. Here, the Norse could have met the last remnants of the Dorset culture, a Paleo-Eskimo people who were already fading from the region, or more likely, the advancing pioneers of the Thule culture, the direct ancestors of the modern Inuit. The Thule were technological marvels of the Arctic, a people in the midst of a rapid expansion eastward from Alaska. They possessed the kayak and the umiak, the toggle harpoon that could securely hold a massive whale or seal, and sophisticated clothing made from expertly sewn sealskin that provided warmth no Norse woolen tunic could match. They lived in semi-subterranean winter houses made of stone, turf, and whalebone, and they hunted the largest creatures in the ocean. A meeting between Norse and Thule would have been a clash of two supremely adapted northern cultures, each viewing the other with a mixture of awe and rivalry. The Norse, with their iron and their ships, represented one kind of power. The Thule, masters of the ice and the sea mammal hunt, represented another. There is little in the sagas to suggest sustained contact here, but the possibility of a fleeting, wary observation from across an icy fjord is a powerful image, two worlds briefly glimpsing each other before continuing on their separate, parallel paths. These first encounters, from tentative trade to open conflict, were a tragic prelude written in miniature. They established a pattern that would be repeated with catastrophic scale centuries later. Europeans arriving with superior metal technology and a sense of entitlement to the land, indigenous peoples defending their homes with a deep knowledge of the terrain, and a fundamental, often violent, failure to communicate or coexist. The Norse departure meant this particular chapter closed before the pattern could fully play out. The Beothuk and the Thule cultures continued for centuries, their ways of life uninterrupted by further European contact. But the seed of a story had been planted in the Norse world, a story of a distant land rich in furs and timber. When the great wave of European colonization finally broke in the late 15th century, it was not launched from Greenland but from Spain, England, and France. Yet the legacy of those first contacts, though forgotten by the new colonizers, had already hinted at the future. It showed that the New World was not empty but full. It showed that its people were not passive but would resist, and it showed that mutual understanding would be the rarest and most fragile commodity of all. The Viking voyages were not the beginning of colonization, but they were the first faint echo of a storm that was still far out at sea. What might have been different if those first meetings had forged a different kind of story, one of partnership instead of fear? Their dream of Vinland faded not from a single defeat, but from a cold calculation of risk against reward. Why did these formidable settlers, who had carved thriving societies from the volcanic rock of Iceland and the frozen fjords of Greenland, ultimately abandon their foothold in a land of such obvious abundance? The answer lies in a stark contrast of circumstances. Iceland and Greenland, for all their challenges, were essentially empty when the Norse arrived. Iceland had a few Irish monks who quickly left, and Greenland's indigenous Dorset population was sparse or absent in the areas they settled. They were pioneers claiming virgin territory, competing only against the elements. Vinland was different. It was not empty, it was home. The vast distance was a logistical nightmare. From Greenland to Vinland was a voyage of over 1,000 miles of open, storm-racked ocean. A message for help was impossible. A supply ship might take years to return if it could even find the settlement again. This isolation meant every loss was permanent, every skirmish depleted irreplaceable resources. In Iceland or Greenland, a bad harvest or a feud could be weathered with help from a neighboring farm a day's ride away. In Vinland, the nearest Norse neighbor was across a sea that was a highway for only a few months of the year. They were not a colony, they were a stranded outpost. Their numbers were fatally small. Thorfinn Karlsefni's expedition, the largest on record, brought perhaps 65 men and a handful of women and children. This was a village, not a nation. To hold and cultivate a territory against a determined indigenous population required not just skill, but overwhelming force or sustained immigration. Neither materialized. The Greenland settlement itself was tiny, perhaps only a few thousand souls at its peak, and could not spare a continuous stream of settlers for a venture that quickly proved dangerous. They lacked the critical mass to absorb losses, to establish a permanent cultural footprint, or to negotiate from a position of undeniable strength. Most crucially, they faced determined, adaptive resistance from people who knew the land intimately. The indigenous populations were not passive recipients of history. They were skilled hunters and warriors who quickly assessed the Norse strengths and weaknesses. They avoided the devastating close combat where Norse steel ruled, instead using guerrilla tactics, the terrain, and psychological warfare like that terrifying exploding projectile. They could retreat into a continent while the Norse were pinned to their shoreline fortifications. This was not a war they could win with one decisive battle. It was an endless, draining conflict that made the very riches of the land, the deep forests, the river valleys, into zones of perpetual danger. The cost of harvesting Vinland's timber became measured in blood. Finally, and perhaps most decisively, the economic equation simply did not add up. Greenland offered them what they needed most: vast pastures for their iconic pastoral lifestyle, and access to unique Arctic goods like walrus ivory that were incredibly valuable in Europe. Vinland offered more timber and furs, but these were luxuries, not necessities. Greenland already had sufficient walrus and seal skins for survival. The grapes and mild winters were alluring, but they were not worth dying for when a hard but sustainable life was already established back east. The risks: constant warfare, catastrophic isolation, the loss of their entire community, far outweighed the potential profits. For the Norse, Vinland was a spectacular discovery but a terrible investment. So they cut their losses, they took what timber they could carry, and they sailed home to the difficult, familiar safety of their Greenland fjords, leaving the promise of America to the mists of legend. Their failure was not one of courage but of practical reality. They had found a new world, but they lacked the numbers, the motive, and the might to keep it. The story of Vinland did not vanish from the world when the last longship sailed east. It retreated into the cultural memory of the Norse, a persistent whisper of lands beyond the Western Sea. In Iceland and Greenland, the sagas were copied and told, keeping the names of Leif and Thorfinn alive for generations. This knowledge was not a secret. Norse sailors continued to sail to Markland, the forested coast of Labrador, for timber well into the 14th century, a practical thread connecting them to the resources of the New World long after the dream of settlement had faded. The voyages became part of their identity, a testament to the far reach of their ancestors. But did this awareness travel beyond the fjords and fishing villages of the North Atlantic? Could whispers of a Western land have seeped into the wider European consciousness? There are tantalizing hints. Some scholars point to medieval maps, like the famous Vinland map whose authenticity is fiercely debated, or to cryptic references in the accounts of later explorers. When Christopher Columbus sailed in 1492, he reportedly visited Iceland years earlier. Could he have heard Old Norse tales of lands across the ocean? We may never know for certain, but the possibility lingers like a ghost in the archives, suggesting that the discovery of America was not a single light switching on, but a slow dawn with many early, faint glimmers. The true legacy of these voyages, however, lies in the profound challenge they pose to our traditional stories. For centuries, the narrative was clear and simple. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and discovered a new world. The Viking voyages shatter that tidy timeline. They prove that human curiosity and capability had already bridged that Atlantic gap, not as a one-time accident, but as a deliberate, sustained effort. This does not diminish Columbus's achievement, which irrevocably linked two hemispheres and changed the course of global history. Instead, it enriches our understanding. History is rarely a straight line of progress from one great man to the next. It is a messy, branching tree of attempts, some of which flourish and some of which wither. The Norse voyages are a magnificent dead-end branch on that tree. They remind us that discovery is not a single event owned by one culture, but a recurring human impulse. Different peoples at different times can find the same truths only to have them lost, forgotten, and found again. The Vikings reached America, but they could not hold it, and their story slipped back into the realm of legend until a trowel in the turf of Newfoundland pulled it into the light. Their saga asks us to hold two truths at once, that a moment can be both historically monumental and historically fleeting, that a failure can be more illuminating than a success. It is a story not of who got there first in a permanent sense, but of the endless, restless human drive to push beyond the horizon, to see what lies over the next wave, regardless of whether the world is ready to remember your name. These long voyages, these fleeting footprints on a new continent, leave us with more than just a corrected date in a history book. They offer a deeper kind of truth, a story written not in conquest but in attempt. It is a tale of human daring at its most raw, the courage to sail off the map into a gray, heaving unknown, guided only by stars, instinct, and the hope of a greener shore. It is a sobering lesson in cultural collision, those first tense moments of contact where curiosity and fear danced a dangerous dance, setting a pattern that would echo for centuries. And above all, it is a story woven through with enduring mystery. We still sift the soil for answers, still debate the meaning of a single coin or a place name, still listen for whispers from the silent ruins in Greenland's fjords. As we drift now toward sleep, let these images settle in your mind like stones on a quiet shore. Picture the dragon-headed longships, their striped sails taut against the wind, cutting through the cold Atlantic fog. See the glow of a turf forge at l-anse-aux-meadows, where a smith's hammer rang out in a new world, mending the nails that held their dreams together. Feel the profound silence of those stone foundations in Greenland, where a community flourished and then faded, leaving only questions in the wind. The Viking voyages to America remind us that history is not a flat, finished page. It is a deep and restless ocean, holding currents we have yet to chart and shores we have forgotten. It is full of stories that end not with a period but with an ellipsis, trailing off into the mists of what might have been. So tonight, as you close your eyes, let the saga of Leif and Thorfinn and Gudrid carry you into peaceful dreams. Perhaps you will dream of northern stars glittering over a black sea, of the scent of pine forests on an unknown coast, or of the quiet courage it takes to journey toward any distant horizon. May your sleep be deep and your dreams be filled with the wonder of lands waiting just beyond the edge of the known. Good night.